Good afternoon. We're going to restart momentarily. If you could please get your seats. So I know it's difficult to pull people away from conversation and coffee, but I can promise you at 5 o'clock there will be more time for a conversation, this time with cocktails. All right, so hold some of your conversation for later on. At 5 o'clock, I'll tell you after the session. So our second panel is Governing After Zero. The idea here is this will be a view from the public sector, but as you gleaned from the last session, it's very difficult to separate even in theory, it's difficult to separate effectively the public and the private sector. The panel will be chaired by Jon Hilsenrath of the Wall Street Journal, and our panelists are Dinah Walker from the Council of Foreign Relations, Kastrop from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and Michael Bordo of the University of Rutgers, or the State University of New Jersey. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. So my objective in this panel is to see if I can frighten you all in the room even more than the last panel did about bubbles and the threats of financial instability after the last financial crisis. But I wanted to start out just by making one observation, which is that as a reporter covering the crisis and the aftermath, I've often described what central banks have been doing and governments have been doing as an experiment in real time. And at times, it's looked like a double-blind clinical trial. You had the Fed right after the crisis pushing interest rates to zero, experimenting with QE, moving very quickly towards bailouts of banks. You've had the ECB at one point after the crisis trying to push up interest rates and being careful about going towards QE. Now we're entering this new stage, and again, it looks like we have central banks going in different directions. We have the Fed in the coming year, at least talking, after the last panel, maybe I'm not so convinced they're going to act, but talking about raising rates next year. And the ECB, of course, talking about starting to launch a QE program, the Bank of Japan in its own little experiment. So it's going to be an interesting year, and we have a great panel to talk about this with different perspectives, particularly from Europe and from the United States. So I'd like to start off asking Dinah to give us her perspective on cross-country analysis of how different authorities have handled the crisis and its aftermath.
Sure. So I think I actually hopefully will make people feel a little bit more optimistic about the world. I joined the domestic money market staff at the New York Fed in January 2009, which was 1 month after the Fed had decided to lower the rate to the zero lower bound. And my impression at that point was that there wasn't going to be a lot more the central bank could do, that we were going to have to rely on fiscal policy to stimulate the economy further. But there were a lot of things the Fed did after that point that I do think supported the recovery and contributed to making the economic situation over the past few years significantly better than it otherwise would have been. The first was the 2009 stress tests that are now going to be repeated annually. The stress tests were able to remove the fear in the market that another major bank was going to collapse the way Lehman had. And the stress tests were successful in doing this because they were tough. They forced the banks to recognize the losses that they had experienced during the financial crisis and raised capital to repair their balance sheets. The Fed could afford to be tough in the stress tests because it knew at that point that it had capital from the Treasury. If banks had been unable to raise capital in private markets, they would have been able to recapitalize those institutions with capital from Treasury. In contrast, the ECB recently completed a year-long stress test, the results of which were released in October of this year. And initially, the data was quite good. It looked like the banks were only going to need to raise about $30 billion in capital. Private estimates had been $60 to $750 billion. But I wrote an article for the Journal earlier this week about the fact that the market reaction was quite bad. Even as the rest of the market took off, bank valuations plummeted. And I think this was because the market didn't perceive these stress tests as being tough and credible the way they had perceived the 2009 stress tests as being tough and credible. The ECB allowed banks to count deferred tax assets, which are really only assets if the bank makes profits in the future, as capital. And in some places like Greece, this is 40% of bank capital right now. And the ECB also ignored the possibility of deflation. They have in their adverse scenario an inflation rate for this year of 1%, which is half their target, but is still more than twice actual inflation in the euro area right now. So the stress tests basically weren't credible the way the US stress tests were. And I think the ECB felt forced to go soft on these stress tests because it didn't know really how the banks would raise the capital that they needed if they were revealed to have a big capital shortfall, because it wasn't clear that the markets were going to come up with the money, and then beyond that, it wasn't clear where the money would come from. I think this is a negative not just for Europe, but also for the US, because over the past 6 years, funding problems in European banks have routinely spilled over into US funding markets. And I think the second big thing the central banks have done over the past few years has been to institute these liquidity swaps with other foreign central banks. In 2008, a lot of funding markets for banks that had been traditionally been available sort of dried up. And this made it necessary for European banks to try even harder to obtain dollars. And in the 3 weeks after Lehman failed, the cost to banks of borrowing for 3 months rose threefold. But the cost of borrowing in the morning was even higher than the cost of borrowing in the afternoon, because that's when European banks were active in the market. So this was a sign that the European bank funding problems were driving up interest rates in the US even beyond what would have happened just as a result of the Lehman failure. So the US Fed engaged in swap lines with the ECB and 13 other central banks to provide dollars to these central banks that they could then provide them to their domestic banks. I think this is probably a policy that may get some use over the next few years. These swap lines, the ones with the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of England, and the ECB have all been made permanent now. So the other great thing about the swap lines was that it made it unnecessary for foreign central banks to sell their reserve assets. And reserve assets are often invested in things like treasuries, agency debt, agency MBS, interest rates the Fed really cared about trying to keep low. And by providing foreign central banks with dollars, it obviated the need to sell these assets in order to obtain the necessary dollar funding. But even though foreign central banks didn't have to sell these assets, interest rates remained too high. And I think that's where you come into the third policy, which has been quite effective over the course of the crisis, although others have clearly disagreed, which is the large-scale asset purchase program. In the companion paper he wrote for this conference, Michael looked at analysis that suggested that the first round of asset purchases had about a 30 to 90 basis point impact on long-term interest rates. The second round had about a 20 basis point impact, and the third round, the impact has been negligible. But I think the proof that that is not exactly an accurate reflection of the impact of these policies was the response last summer to Bernanke's comments that these policies could at some point end. And after he said that, the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury almost doubled from 1.6 to 3%. And mortgage rates, corporate borrowing rates, a lot of rates that really matter to the US economy soared alongside the Treasury rate. So I think that these policies have been more effective than some of the sort of event studies around announcement dates have shown. So to conclude, Stan Fisher last year said that he was going to be revising his textbook soon, because it had said that once you get to the zero lower bound, you have to rely on fiscal policy. And clearly, the past 6 years have shown that there's still a lot the central bank can do even after you've reached the zero lower bound to stimulate the economy.
Okay, Christian, you're up next. Why don't you give us, I think you're giving us a perspective on Europe, but let's hear your take.
Yeah, thank you. You gave me a nice try. I also thought about a medical thing when starting my talk here. I thought about what do we have? Do we have one disease? Do we have several diseases? We have vaccinations. Do the vaccinations work for everybody or only for a certain part of that? And what is when the diseases interact? And so there are a lot of things you could probably devote a view to. So I think the big problem, and this was tackled already, and I would dive into that a little bit, is the strong divergency of things. And sometimes this is a bit overlooked when we just see one disease and one vaccination. So I think the overall picture is a bit more complex, and I would like to come back. You may not like it that people think it's more complex. So of course it would be much better we have one single vaccination for a single disease, but I fear we do not have. So looking at the US, it has already been tackled by the last panel and by the startup. Of course you would, in a certain way, you would say, hey, come on, you can do a bit less on macro, so do less here, and then leading into others. For the European Union, you may say there is still the fear of deflation looking very bad. They would say on the macro side, do more. Coming to Japan, it's again a bit complicated. There we have a quite pervert recommendation. Do counteracting things. So do more on macro, but also do kind of a vaccination which does not really help on the macro side, but do more on structural, and it's very true. And for the emerging markets, you have also what you can say, do take care. I think there are a lot of volatility risks, and they were already been mentioned. They're coming from the financial system. I could mention some more if you wish. So I fear I'm a bit more pessimistic again. But what is it all about? And I think the entire thing is that we really find a tailored sequence thing between macroeconomic policies, which is monetary policy, fiscal policy, and which is not mentioned so far, structural policy. So what do we need in the structural reform agenda? And this is very important. How do we make this interact? And of course, then again, if we have these vaccinations, which will still be a problem, if all this works out in a very different way, this might be helpful for any individual region or country in a certain cases, but probably this does not really fit together in an overarching picture for the global economy. So it is the possibility what you would do for a specific region or country would not fit to what other countries have to do to go against their diseases. So, and of course there is an issue starting with the US. I think of course, starting with monetary in the US, they're doing well. I think probably the vaccine was successful. Now they have to do the tapering, and you discussed this already, but with the tapering, of course, you create risks for the world economy, especially on the emerging side. On fiscal, there's one interesting result for the US, which has always been overlooked a bit. Of course, US often complains about high austerity in Europe, and it's too much austerity. The funny thing is, if you look at Japan, European Union, Eurozone, and US, you will see that the greatest effort in austerity is coming from the US. So the change of the primary balance in the US from a very negative primary balance to a very positive primary balance is huge. It's much bigger than any change in the primary of the Eurozone. So that's also something funny, sometimes overlooked. Coming to Japan, again in Japan it's about the famous third arrow. So they're doing a lot on macro. Now it has already been said, it's a, how you say, whatever it takes, squares two. So they're doing everything as long as it takes, whatever it takes. I think, again, I'm also thinking it's a very dangerous path, and you do not really see the positive results. So somebody said Abenomics don't work. I'm also sharing some skepticism here, has already been made. So coming now to the Eurozone, I think this is probably also another issue. In the Eurozone, it's really a bit complicated. Of course, the Eurozone has, and this is the OECD telling the world, they have a demand problem. Yes, they have, but of course we also have to look, if we go against it, we have to see what caused it. And of course the demand problem was caused through a long neglected structural reform agenda, which leads in a way to adding financial, say, oil into this whole issue, to safeguard competitiveness of some countries here and there, and then you end up with very bad competitiveness, and on the other hand you end up with very high indebtedness. And this of course makes any macroeconomic policy in the Eurozone extremely tricky. And I think the very important issue we have in the architecture of the Europeans is, of course, you can not really do what the Fed has been done or what the Bank of England has been done, because in the Eurozone you simply have a fragmented economics and fiscal policy. And this makes it awfully difficult because it creates a whole area of moral hazard. And if you look a bit at the last years, you will clearly see whenever Draghi says whatever it takes, whenever even earlier there was a big LTRO and all the other programs on the monetary side you see, you can really look that immediately some politicians in some countries scale down their things and say, good luck, Trichet or now Draghi is doing the job for me. And of course, if we want to do this monetary macroeconomic policy, of course, it will only work, it will buy you time, but in the end, something else has to kick in to get it restarted again. So I think kickstarting the economy just with macroeconomic policy without any tailored structural agenda, I would still see as a very fragile construct, and especially with these fragmented political issues in the European Union, it will probably never work. Fiscal in Europe is another issue. I think there could be a bit more flexibility on fiscal in the European Union. Some countries are better off, for instance Germany. Germany could not now deliver the so-called, you may have heard this, they are going for a black zero on the budget. I think this is in line with the deteriorating figures on the macroeconomic side, maybe a bit overselling, overdoing a good argument. So there is flexibility, fiscal flexibility can be used. On the other hand, there is not that much available, especially in some countries which are very high indebted and where you can clearly see that markets react with an immediate loss of credibility. And I am not any dogmatic in macro side or Keynesian effects or Ricarian effects, but we have to be aware that they all may happen. Coming to the structural reforms, and then I will stop, there is another issue. I think a lot of the peripheral countries in the Eurozone, the so-called problem countries, program countries, have done quite a lot of structural reform. Again, on the cost of a tough deleveraging on the real economy, which feeds into this demand side problem. There is another issue in some core countries. So again, some core countries I think really now have to deliver. I already mentioned Germany. There is a big issue of neglecting public investment, so they run down on their public capital stock for quite a while. They could do better. Another big country which is, as Germany, very decisive for the long-term success of the Eurozone is France. I think France is doing a lot of good announcements, but still the results are not that favorable. We try to encourage them from the OECD. We make a big paper for Hollande telling him, if you do this, this would help you and whole Europe quite a lot, but still France has to deliver. The same is true for Italy. Italy has quite a good record on the fiscal side, also on the long-term sustainability of public finance, but they are still very poor on the labor market and also on some parts of the highly regulated sectors in their economy, which could probably be done much more. So I stop it here for the question round.
All right, so we'll move next to Michael Bordo. And I should say, Michael is an economic historian. Often when I've wanted some perspective on financial crises and how they compare historically, I've given Michael a call. So I think you're going to give us some historical perspective on where we stand today.
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on the United States, and I'm going to talk primarily about the exit strategy that's coming up. But before I do that, I want to give, as John said, an historical perspective. So the recent era of low interest rates, which is about to end, is not the first such episode in Federal Reserve history. The interest rates were close to zero in the 1930s and the 1940s. And initially that reflected the deflation of the Great Contraction of 1929 to 33, which lowered nominal interest rates from 1930 onwards. And then later, after 1933, expansionary monetary policy by the Treasury and not by the Fed, by Treasury gold policy, kept interest rates low until the recession of 1937-38. And then at the end of the decade of the 30s, the Fed began following a low interest rate peg at the behest of the Treasury to help funding of the debt in the build-up and then during World War II. And the interest rate peg that became official in 1942 lasted until February 1951 with the Federal Reserve Treasury Accord. And in a sense, once World War II ended and price controls were lifted, the low interest rate policy contributed to a buildup of inflation. So the Fed pushed very hard in the late 40s for its independence from the Treasury. And they wanted to regain the use of the tools of monetary policy to fight inflation. And after the Accord, the Fed raised rates and gradually normalized monetary policy. Now, most of the securities that the Fed held in the late 1940s and 50s consisted of short-term T-bills. So the Fed had a very big balance sheet relative to GDP. It wasn't that different from what they have right today. In nominal terms, it's a lot less. And so what they did was they simply allowed them to run off. And they didn't engage in large-scale open market sales of securities except in 1949 and 1950, nor did it engage in large purchases of securities. So as the economy grew, the size of the Fed's portfolio just shrunk relative to GDP. Okay, well today the environment's very different from the 1940s. Rates have been kept low not to finance a world war, but to promote recovery from a serious recession. And so the case for raising rates today is that the U.S. economy is recovering nicely from the recession. And I talk quite a bit about that in my background paper. And rates need to rise to prevent the buildup of asset price booms and inflation, as other people have mentioned. So what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes is the exit strategy by the Fed and what its consequences might be for the U.S. Treasury. So for the Federal Reserve, as the economy recovers, the Fed's poised to raise its policy interest rate. But it may stall on this until mid-2015 or longer because the Fed's measure of inflation is considerably below its target. But as Charles just said in the preceding panel, increasing wage pressure suggests that inflation is going to pick up, and there's a risk if they don't do it sooner. So the question is, how are they going to do it? Okay, so the traditional way of doing it before 2007 was you raise the federal funds rate back to normal. And that raises the question, what's normal? Well, it's supposed to be the nominal interest rate that's consistent with full employment and inflation close to the Fed's 2% target. Well, if the growth rate of potential output is 2.5% to 3% and inflation is 2%, then the normal Fed's fund rate would be in the 4 to 5% range, which is what it was before the crisis. But since the crisis, or even earlier, it may be considerably less, like some people argue, maybe 3 to 4%, because of a slowdown in productivity growth, or because of the arguments raised by Larry Summers, which I don't really believe, by the opponents of the revived stagnation thesis. But then on the other hand, you've got these really positive forces like the oil fracking boom, continued success of Silicon Valley, which may put us back closer to our long-run trends. So then the next question is, well, how are they going to do it? Okay. Well, traditionally they would do it by raising the federal funds rate, and the FOMC would raise the funds rate by using open market operations to decrease the quantity of reserves until the funds rate rose to the target rate. Okay. But to do that, And I'm going to get into things that are a little bit complicated, and there are some Fed people here who can tell me if I'm wrong. The Fed would have to sell off all of its extra assets in its balance sheet in order to start raising the rate above zero. And the Fed's portfolio is so large that selling everything quickly over the course of 6 months or so, that could cause financial market disruptions and an undesirable spike in long-term rates. And so instead, they're talking about raising the interest rates they charge commercial banks on their excess reserves. And by raising this IOER and relying on market forces, they argue this would ensure that the funds rate and other short-term rates would rise with it. So what the Fed would do is they'd set a target range for the funds rate, like let's say 0.75 to 1%, and then the board would set the IOER at a level consistent with the FOMC's choice, like say 1% at the top of the range. And so under this new approach, they could still say that the FOMC is tightening monetary policy by raising the federal funds rate, and the quantity of reserves are going to remain much higher than under the traditional approach. But then there's some concern that this might not happen smoothly, in part because the federal funds rate has been persistently so much below the IOER. So what the Fed may do instead is engage in what they call reverse repo transactions with non-bank financial institutions. And what that is, that reverse repo facility, is a way of allowing non-banks to deposit funds with the Fed and earn interest on them. And so the reverse repo transactions are a financial transaction whose economic effect is earning interest on a deposit at the Fed. So what the Fed's going to likely do is it's going to sell assets to non-bank counterparties and then agree to buy them back at a fixed price, so do a swap. And essentially the counterparty's lending funds to the Fed, which decreases reserves, and the Fed's providing collateral for the loan from the securities in its portfolio. Well, the third question, and then this relates to history, is over the pace and timing of the tightening. So if it's like the gradual tightening from 2004 to 2006, it might be too slow to prevent an asset price boom or run up inflation. Or if it's too fast, like the tightening that occurred in 1993 to 1994 because of an inflation scare, then we could get an unwanted recession or a crisis in the emerging markets. So they're sort of got a, it's going to be difficult to see exactly how they do it. It's a bit of a tightrope. And the last thing I wanted to just mention very briefly, as I discussed in my background paper, rising interest rates could have significant effects on the fiscal deficit and the national debt, because as rates rise, so do the costs of servicing the debt, which then raises both the deficit and the debt. And moreover, if the Fed were to tighten too much, leading to a recession, which happened quite a lot in the history of the Fed, and I've written a lot about this, then the resulting decline in GDP would reduce tax revenues and raise both the deficit and the debt, so that's a risk. And then if the deficit and the debt rises, then the old issues, not that old, but relatively old, in beltway terms it's old, issues of entitlements will come to the fore again. And the population's aging and Social Security payments, as well as expenditures on Medicare and Obamacare, they're going to rise, leading to the political challenges of how do you contain them. And finally, if the Fed manages the exit well, which history says they have, not too often, but they have done it, okay, and we get back to the era of the Great Moderation with moderate and stable economic growth and low inflation, then the fiscal issues will become less urgent.
Well, so I just want to ask the audience for a little personal sympathy, because that exit strategy that you just described in great detail, I've got to explain to my editors on a regular basis. It's not a very easy thing to do. Maybe we can get Seth Carpenter to grade Michael later on about how he described that. So I just want to ask you a few questions. Dinah, you described a number of tools that the Fed used and economic policymakers use more broadly to respond to this crisis. The panel before us raised a lot of concerns about the next financial crisis, about asset bubbles in particular resulting from quantitative easing policies and low interest rate policies. What's your response to that? And describe to us, you spent some time at the New York Fed on the markets desk. How concerned were you and your colleagues then about causing these kinds of problems, and how concerned should people in the audience be now that we're heading in that direction?
I think there is a concern that, asset prices are out of line with historical norms, and that the Fed has played some role in raising asset prices. And if you listen to the way Bernanke describes how quantitative easing or how the asset purchases work, it's by, removing treasuries from the market, and when you do that, then people buy mortgage-backed securities, and the people who used to hold mortgage-backed securities buy high-yield bonds, and those people buy emerging market debt. So there is something to this idea that the Fed's actions over the past 6 years have, contributed to raising asset prices. But I'm skeptical of the idea that there's much the Fed can really do about this without, causing problems for the real economy. And the Fed has an inflation target and an unemployment target, and both of those suggest that policy is too tight right now. They are underperforming the inflation target, and unemployment is too high. So I think this idea that in order to address asset prices, that they would raise interest rates, doesn't sit well with me, to be perfectly honest. I think that they need to try to address their mandate, and that asset prices in certain markets may seem out of whack, but that that's unfortunately a consequence of how the Fed's been forced to deal with the crisis because of the financial crisis, and that the Fed shouldn't respond to asset prices by changing policy, basically.
Michael, should asset prices be in the Fed's considerations when it thinks about a 2% inflation goal?
Well, I agree with everything that Diana said. I think I think that the Fed should focus on its mandate right now, and that if you get a stock market boom bust, so what? I mean, asset boom, house price. We aren't going to have a house price boom bust. That's a much more serious story. But we've had lots of stock market crashes. I just don't think this should be their main focus.
So, Christian, I want to ask you to respond to Diana's critique of the latest round of ECB stress tests. Her point, maybe I'm exaggerating here, was that it failed, that the market doesn't see it as having been credible, that the ECB was too easy on the banks and in its formulations of what a stress scenario looks like. What's your take? Was it, were those stress tests successful?
Let me say, I think it was much better than the first one. So I think there was clearly an improvement about the stress tests from the ECB. To be very personal, my personal view was when I heard about that, I think at least for the preventive side of the road, they should have killed 2 or 3 banks. Maybe not just ones who trigger a crisis, but so that simply nearly everybody except some Italian banks could get through. I also thought it would be a bit on the weak side. And if we talk about all these market behaviors and about those complex channels who were just mentioned by you, I think you see there's a lot of psychology around. Yeah? So we are not in the pure field of economics here. We are in the field of socio-psychology linked to economics a bit. So this is what the ECB tries. Yeah. So and if you follow the directors from the ECB, they say we are doing psychology. We are doing not so much economics. So coming back to your stress test question, I think on the other hand, we should not forget that in the latter thing of the stress test, I think there were 2 very important issues, and these issues have been also a bit overlooked. First of all, the stress test clearly shows that if you look at the full fulfillment of the Basel III arrangements, a lot of banks would have a bit more difficulties. So I think now you could ask why didn't they do it in the first stance, but they didn't. This is maybe a failure. But so if they have to go for Bail 3 in a minute, some more banks would have problems. Another issue which is a bit overlooked and I think which is very worthwhile part of the stress test is the mentioning of the unfunded loans. And I think the unfunded loans problem also points a bit to the issues which still have to be tackled. I think the ECB, they had to do a very tricky issue. It should be biting, the markets should believe it bites, and I think in a certain degree it went well. On the other hand, it shouldn't be as biting to endanger people, again, to move the psychology in the wrong direction. So I would say it's better. It maybe could have done even better, but I think it was not a bad exercise overall.
Michael, I want to turn to you and talk for a minute about the Fed exit. I often hear from readers questions about how is the Fed going to wind down a $4 trillion balance sheet? How is it possible? How are they going to push up interest rates when they have so many assets on their balance sheet? When I look at the history of the Fed's balance sheet, and you talked a little bit about this, and the history of rates, what I see in the 1940s and 50s is a very slow exit from very low interest rate policies and from, as you said, a very large balance sheet. So why shouldn't the public be confident now that the Fed can exit from this thing in the very gradual way that they've said that they're going to?
I mean, I think they can. In fact, that's why a lot of people have been saying, you don't have to sell off your balance sheet quickly. I mean, most people don't talk about the 40s, the 30s and 40s and the early 50s, but they say, we have tools to do it. We have the interest rate on excess reserves. Okay, so we don't have to sell off the balance sheet. I mean, a lot of stuff's going to roll over eventually, but that we can do it. Or we have this other backup tool, this reverse repo thing, if that doesn't work very well. But so I'm not convinced that this balance sheet problem is a game killer for them. I think they can do it.
I want to ask you all about coordination problems that we've seen in the aftermath of the financial crisis. I see coordination problems on two levels. Within countries, you see very few examples in which fiscal policymakers and monetary policymakers have gotten to the policy mix that economists always say is the ideal one. You get to the zero bound and you use fiscal policy, but you make credible promises to reduce deficits in the long run. And I can't see a country that succeeded in coordinating policy effectively. But then when I look on from a global perspective, it looks like policy globally is very poorly coordinated right now. We're entering a period in 2015 where the Fed could be raising interest rates when the ECB and the Bank of Japan are expanding their quantitative easing programs. And it begs the question, why couldn't they coordinate and and work in unison from the get-go? So here's my question: what lessons? Do you agree with that observation? And what lessons have we learned, or should policymakers learn from this experience about coordinating globally and coordinating within countries? Dinah, I'll let you start off with this first.
So I think on the first question of coordinating monetary and fiscal policy, I think everyone always talks about Draghi's statement that we are prepared to do whatever it takes to save the euro, but less attention is paid to what he said next, which was, believe me, it will be enough. And I think that statement is problematic because the ECB really doesn't have the power and authority to keep the euro together. And I think statements like that from central banks, I don't know if politicians are convinced by them, but I hope they aren't. I hope there isn't a sense that the central bank is so powerful that politicians don't need to do anything to keep the economy going. And I think one of the downsides of the extremely effective monetary policy that's been done over the past few years has been that fiscal policymakers haven't been as active as they should have been in addressing long-term issues, but at the same time enacting short-term fiscal stimulus. And on the monetary policy coordination internationally, I think during the crisis there was more monetary policy coordination than I think we've seen in non-crisis times. In October 2008, I think it was 6 banks all decided to cut interest rates at the same time. And the liquidity swaps were another instance, I believe, of policy coordination across central banks. So I think, when it was really needed, there was a fair amount of
But the
coordination.
ECB was literally raising interest rates when the Fed was thinking about expanding its own balance sheet. And the Bank of Japan was kind of sitting still when the Fed was launching QE after QE. I mean, was that a failure of coordination?
I think that was a failure on the part of the ECB and the Bank of Japan. I don't think that was a failure of coordination. No. I mean, I think the Fed probably would have preferred those policies not be taken, but they're foreign governments, and the Fed has no authority, obviously, to tell them what to do. And I think those, particularly the ECB raising rates at that point, was a mistake, and I think it's been shown to have been a mistake at this point.
Any other panelists have any thoughts on this coordination question?
Yeah. Well, if I look at the history of it, I think it's policy coordination has almost virtually always been a failure. And monetary policy coordination, fiscal policy coordination. I mean, just thinking about some of the failures of the not that distant past, we think about, the locomotive problem, the locomotive that we're going to have the Germans, the U.S. is going to have the Germans follow an expansionary policy to help them, help the U.S. Get out of its recession, and it didn't work. It just caused trouble for Germany. And then at the Louvre Accord, was it the Louvre or the Plaza? They pushed Japan to follow an expansionary policy to lower the yen and help the dollar. And again, that got Japan into the asset price boom. So I can go through lots of stories that never worked. I can talk about the London Economic Conference in 1933 about having monetary policy coordination. Completely blew up. Okay, so I'm skeptical. I think that what happened in 2008 was really unusual. And it was driven by the fact that it was in the interests of all these central banks to do it. And most times it's not in their interest, especially with fiscal. The sovereign interests are never lined up. So when you try to impose a fiscal policy change on a country that's going against what it really would do, it's going to backfire. And the U.S. could do it because it was a big gun in the past. But it's hard to do that now. Christian?
Yeah, first of all, I think there are coordination problems within countries. There is a bigger coordination problem in the Eurozone because the Eurozone is no country, which makes it even worse. And of course, there it is much needed. And of course, it is a big issue for the Eurozone really to look at least at some minimal elements of a kind of a fiscal and economic union. So there is an issue to be made. It's an own issue. We could discuss this at length because it's difficult in such a heterogeneous area with a lot of different traditions and a history, which also has some advantages, but there it is clearly a disadvantage. And this, of course, as I already mentioned, the moral hazard problem, of course, this will also influence, I think, the channels where these QE measures might work. Yeah? Just mentioning one single example, European corporates are not so much financed on bonds. They are financed more on banks, which makes channels very difficult. And if the ECB buys something, what will they buy? Somebody has looked at the trillion they wanted to buy. What can they buy? They can buy maybe some ABS, but not the mezzanine of any structured product. So in the end, they end up with state bonds. And then you can think about what will happen, who holds state bonds, who will get rich, and what will he do with this, say, little bubble. He is a profiteur. Huh? Maybe he would think it's just a bubble, it anyway will bust, so I don't do anything, so no channel. So coming to the international organization, you will not be surprised, as being in part of an international organization, I strongly believe we need more and better international coordination. Of course, it's difficult and tricky, and I agree, there is not really a history of successes. But on the other hand, we cannot deny that it's even more necessary in the future. So I think there has to be some coordination, and this is especially the case if, say, as I put it in my initial remark, different diseases with different vaccinations are not really fitting together. So if everybody wants to do just what is best for his own, maybe a good idea, but the overall result may be, due to some spillovers, quite bad. And I think we had this discussion. Remember, beggar my neighbor. Japan wants to get down the currency. Eurozone wants to get down the currency. So they can't do it all at the same moment in time. It will lead to the absolute negative result. So it is necessary. Who can do it? The G20 tries a bit. I'm responsible for the G20 business as far as the OECD is concerned, at least for this growth issue. And there you clearly see that it is a very hard job to do. But I would not say it's complete without success. So we have, even if there is no success story, we have to. For me, there's simply no alternative.
Okay, so I'm not much more confident about European banks. I'm not much more confident about the prospects of coordination, and I'm a little less worried about the Fed's exit. With that, why don't we open it up to some audience questions and see what you all have on your minds.
What about, excuse me, how would Russia and or Greece, throw a fly in the ointment?
I can start. I think let's start with Greece. Of course, I also see the problem if a certain election would lead to a certain result, and of course we see already some first signals of that markets anticipate that. I'm quite worried about that, and I think it can come back to the situation we had some. I guess now it's 2 years ago, where really. There was an issue. What are we going to do with Greece if they don't do this, if they don't do that? I think this is an issue, again, which adds to your argument. There is still no real answer on the no bailout argument. So far, of course, in the Eurozone, they say the no bailout argument in principle is valid, but of course they have undermined it quite a lot. So there's a kind of a creeping bailout, and they hope they get through with this and can in the end then tell the principle has never been preserved, and then everybody would clap their hands and say it's a very intelligent policy. On the other hand, if at a certain point in time one country goes completely across the edge for whatever reason, and you mentioned just one country with a possible reason, I think then they really have to rethink this. But I would not would make any statement except under very strict Chatham House rules what might happen then. On Russia, it's of course. First of all, we saw not that much for quite a while in our data. Now, of course, except the sentiment channel. But of course, now we see a bit, especially also again in Germany, export figures. So we now see some more hard facts. So I think it's slowly evolving. And of course, the Russian issue could be very critical, also linked to other geopolitical risks. I should mention also ISIS and all these other things. So this could also add up quite a burden to the world economy, even calling for more governance. So I still hope that there are some insightful people around in Russia and other counterparts which can sort it out in a best possible way. But I agree that there are some tensions, and it will be difficult to get rid of that.
If I may, I just have two questions. A quick one for Dinah. I'm just curious, does the U.S. have any counterparty risk when they establish the swap lines with these foreign central banks? And then secondly, I'll ask, and then I'll give up the mic. I'm kind of curious about the failure of conventional wisdom with regard to the inflationary aspects of QE. People who run tens, hundreds of billions of dollars in global macro funds and others were betting on the fact that this was going to be highly inflationary. And I've heard Jamie Dimon mention that, well, $3 trillion relative to the value of all government and corporate debt securities and equity securities is pretty small, and maybe that's the reason it wasn't inflationary. I've also heard that the velocity of money had dropped rapidly, and so maybe that was just a sort of a mathematical thing. You put in that much money and the velocity drops. But it seems that to understand that will be important as we go forward, because if in fact it was a velocity question. Well, who knows what the velocity will be and how quickly the transmission mechanism kicks this money back in? I mean, it seems like it's a big pool of gas waiting on someone to light a match. So anyway, my two quick questions. Thank you.
Why don't you answer? What would,
Yeah, I've done some work on this actually. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind if you think in terms of quantity theory of money, which you raised. So money growth was actually, broad money growth was actually low until and really not high enough to push up inflation until 2010, and it's been rising now. It's about 6% per year. Okay, second, velocity. So what happened to velocity, the velocity of broad money, is very similar to what happened in the 1930s. Okay, so people really started hoarding money because of uncertainty in the 30s. And then in the 40s and 50s, they basically got out of it, and V sort of went like this. It came back. Okay, now what's happening now is you would expect the same thing. Okay, and I've done some research with some guys at the Dallas Fed, and it seems like the Dodd-Frank bill has sort of affected the predicted bounce back in velocity because of it's changed the returns on equities relative to money holding, but that otherwise it would be doing that. Okay, so I would have thought that the increase in M and the bounce back in V would be pushing us into inflation, and I think there is still some of that that's possible.
Can I just follow up on that for a second? I think this idea about the pool of reserves being inflationary at some point relies on a way of thinking that was consistent with the way the Fed operated before the crisis, in which the Fed adjusted the amount of reserves, and that affected the overnight interest rate, which was the target. Now, with interest on excess reserves, you can have a huge pool of reserves and just set an interest rate without having to drain reserves. There may be some difficulties with, they initially thought interest on excess reserves would be a floor, because why would anyone lend to another bank at lower than what they get from the central bank? But some counterparties aren't eligible to earn interest on excess reserves, so they were lending at lower rates. But with the reverse repurchases, they're hoping to be able to withdraw that liquidity that had been pushing overnight interest rates below the interest on excess reserves rate. So I don't think that pool of reserves is inflationary the way it would have been in the absence of interest on excess reserves. On the counterparty risk question, there is a certain amount of counterparty risk involved in this, but it's to the foreign central bank. It's not to the banks to which the foreign central bank lends. I think this, had an effect in terms of who the Fed was willing to extend liquidity swaps to during the crisis. There were only 4 emerging economies, and the amounts were quite small. Whereas with the ECB, the Fed was comfortable making it unlimited and lending $300 billion to the ECB, because there really wasn't, I don't think, concern that the ECB wasn't going to pay them back. And it's collateralized with euros in the case of the ECB swap. So the US does have something in exchange for the dollars it's providing, but if there were a huge swing in currency valuations over the course of the swap, of course, you could end up losing money potentially.
would the Fed lose money on that swap, or would the ECB be losing money?
I mean, it would depend on how the currency moves. So if we had euros and the value of the euro tanked, which presumably it would be in a scenario in which the ECB is not willing to give us our dollars back, the US could lose money.
I was under the impression that the ECB is on the line to pay back dollars and not euros. As a result,
It is, but if we held euros, so the US gives the ECB dollars, we receive euros in return. If the ECB says, we lent your dollars to a bank and they've now defaulted and we don't have the dollars, sorry, we can't give them back to you, we would be holding euros at that point. So depreciation of the euro would potentially result. I mean, I think it's an extremely unlikely event, which is why the Fed felt comfortable doing this, but it's possible.
I think we had another question back there, and then we'll come to Seth.
Yeah, Ira Strauss for Christian. Since you're from the OECD, I'd like you to revisit this issue of coordination. And I think it has to be done in a comparative context. It's as if we're saying coordination fails because there's not effective coordination. But the opposite of coordination is not absence of coordination, it's conflict. And in between, there's competition in varying degrees of friendliness or hostility. And on the other side of coordination, there's collaboration, union, common policy. So taking it in isolation, if coordination has been enough to prevent conflict, that's a tremendous success rather than a failure. If one compares to the 1930s, I think one can see a considerable advance. So I'd wonder how you'd evaluate it in that kind of comparative context. That's the first part. The second part, you are with the OECD. OECD was set up to produce more than coordination. It was set up as OEEC with the Marshall Plan to produce an economic union of Europe, which has advanced at least halfway there. So we're beyond coordination, even though not all coordination works within that in some spheres. And the goal of people like William Clayton was to get a similar union on the Atlantic level and ultimately the global level, but much, much further down the road. I'm wondering how you see things in that context also between, if you look at the whole OECD system, NATO, European Union, G7, OECD, do we have a failure of coordination or do we have a success or do we have something more than coordination in the classical sense?
In a way, I think we have all of that. Yeah, the question, indeed, we have some success stories. We have some stories where it didn't work at all. I think we have one very good success story right now at the OECD. This is the BEPS project. Yeah, of course, you can also think about some things there, but I think this is a good project. So I think cooperation might lead to very favorable results in that case. In other cases, we are not that good. And of course, I think we still have to evolve. I think responsibility for overarching issues which are simply global. And I think with this, globalization is such an ugly word, but in this all interconnectedness of things, I think we need we need more mechanisms. I'm strongly convinced about that. We need more mechanisms how we sort it out. And of course, this does not mean that we do all the whitewash. Sometimes it may mean now this goes first and then this goes first. I said cooperation does not mean we make something which does not fit for everybody, but we can also talk about sequencing. We can talk about phasing in of a kind of a structural agenda, for instance, with macroeconomic necessities. So we can do much better. And I think this is where the OECD is a bit working on. And I would think there are all mechanisms to be used. And of course, it's not just coordination does not just mean politicians get together and sort it out. Of course, political coordination mechanisms for me would always come after we make the right fix for the market really working. And so there is an issue using the market as a coordination instrument too, and especially when the spreads were mentioned. What do you see in the relatively low spreads for some European countries? Do you see a bit better performance? Yes, you see some better performance, but most of all you see that the markets believe in the creeping bailout. So I think, so it has to be an interplay of different models. Yeah? So that would be my point. And let me make one remark to the last discussion. I think it's really funny. We have to think a bit more about that there is so much risk appetite on some investor side, and there's so less risk appetite on those people who would like to do the real investment, starting new businesses, making new interesting investments. So I think this leads again, and this is another coordination issue, how can we kickstart it? How can we make all this macroeconomic policy more on the monetary side, less on fiscal due to several reasons? How can we use this time to kickstart the real economy? And there we have less answers. Yeah?
Doesn't this beg the question that perhaps policymakers are force-feeding an economy that doesn't want to eat? Seth.
I think I actually have a reasonably simple question. And Mike Bordo, when you were giving your talk, you may have alluded to some of what the answer is, but even the title of the conference today, Life After Zero, which is about presumably interest rates, and then the subtitle is Implications of Unconventional Monetary Policy. So my question is, there was a lot of talk about the Fed's asset purchases, the other central banks' sort of large-scale asset purchases, or QE. I don't use that term for what the Fed did. and how that affected asset prices, pushing up asset prices, whether or not asset prices should be in the Fed's mandate. But over the breadth of history of monetary policy, anytime there is a slump or a recession, lowering interest rates is necessarily pushing up asset prices, at least for fixed income securities, just essentially by definition. So in that sense, it doesn't seem as if there's a material difference between the unconventional part and traditional monetary policy. The discussion about the exit, or whatever one wants to talk about it, there's the timing of it, whether it's going to wait too long, in which case it'd be inflation, or go too soon, in which you'd choke off an incipient recovery, seems to me to be the canonical problem of monetary policy. The size of the balance sheet and whether or not the quantity of reserve balances in the banking system is inflationary, part of the answers you all gave seemed to suggest that they were technical nuisances as opposed to something fundamental. So is there anything about this particular business cycle and the expansion of the central bank's balance sheet, particularly the Fed, that is in any way materially different? Is there any, is this sort of unconventional monetary policy, the asset purchase program, is that actually anything that's particularly relevant to this discussion, or is it just incidental technical nuisances and we're just sort of talking about monetary policy following a particularly severe recession?
Michael, you want to take that one?
I guess I focus on the last point, that it's really how you exit from a severe recession once the recovery begins. And I've always found that the Fed, not always, but lots of times you guys are slow in exiting on the recovery, and that often leads to problems later on of inflation, and then you tighten fast, and then you get a recession. So that's been the normal, not normal, but quite often risk that you've been running. And I see that again as a problem. That's my sort of source of where things can go wrong. You guys are going to stall and stall and stall for reasons that aren't really connected with monetary policy. Their reasons are the labor market and concerns about long-term unemployment and structural issues, which might have even started before the crisis. And so the longer you guys kick the can down the road and wait, I think the risks are greater that you're going to end up causing problems for another recession in the next few years.
Can I throw out? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't think there's anything different particularly, except I think it was David who said that Greenspan had said that we don't directly affect the long-term rate, and I think that idea that the Fed controls short-term rates but allows the market to decide long-term rates is different this time. I think there's a much more explicit action to change long-term interest rates, which actually makes me more optimistic about the unwind, because on the other side it means that the Fed has this huge pool of assets. So if it raises short rates and long rates don't respond as they would like, they can sell some of these long-term assets and directly affect long rates in the opposite direction. But other than that, I would agree. I don't think there's really anything so unconventional about what the Fed has been doing.
Well,
if I may add one issue, of course, I would strongly support what Michael just has said. Of course, if the new is an heretic thought, maybe if really one of the new macroeconomic instruments we have in the globalized world is to create a bubble. Yeah, so bubbles are bad, but what we are doing on monetary policy is we create a bubble up to a certain degree, and we are very confident to get it bust not too late. And I think this is really a strong story. So we have to think about that. So, and I discussed this issue with some friends at the G20, and they agree. They say, yes, this is what we do. We do macroeconomic policy with a controlled creation of a bubble. And then at the right point in time, we use our macroprudential and cut it down. Whether this works as nicely in all situations, at least from the history, I'm also a bit skeptic, but maybe there's no other choice. I have no idea.
So, Dinah, I want to challenge your agreement with Seth and offer Seth the opportunity to respond too.
I just asked a question I didn't ask.
I'm still going to offer you the opportunity to respond, because it seems to me there are some things here that are very much different than what we've experienced before. First of all, I mean, it's called unconventional policy. This is a policy that has not been used, and as a result, the implications of it are poorly understood. Using a balance sheet at the zero bound, the theory of it, I mean, Ben Bernanke himself said this is something that works in practice but not in theory. I think that was his line. I would also say what seems to me to be very much different now from at least the last 20 or 30 years of experience is that the central bank has no Taylor rule or no other policy rule to guide it and test it against some model for effectiveness or where it's going to lead, and that, to a certain extent, leaves the central bank astray. So it seems to me that there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainties about the costs and effects of the costs and benefits of the way these policies work.
I guess I don't see it as being quite as different. I think at some point Bill Dudley gave an estimate for, how much asset purchases are equivalent to a 25 basis point cut in the short-term interest rate. And I do think that this idea of directly trying to affect longer-term rates is quite different, and the implications are not well understood. If the Fed is even able, by buying assets, to lower interest rates. I mean, there's been a lot of debate about whether that's even effective today. But the Fed is still attempting to influence interest rates, which are the standard monetary policy. So I don't really think it's as different, except that it hasn't really been done much before.
Well, so just to push back one more time, those estimates of the effects on interest rates from QE are based on very tenuous event studies that, I mean, it's very hard to say that those are actual effects that equate to Fed funds rate movements.
I think it's difficult to put an estimate on the amount. I think Bill Dudley said it was $500 billion was equivalent to 25 basis point rate cut. I think those sort of estimates are difficult to do. I haven't heard him say that since I think it was 2009 when he said that. But I do think it's still affecting interest rates, which is how the Fed affects the economy. And whereas before, Greenspan used to complain that they were raising the overnight rate and the 10-year really wasn't responding, and what you really care about is what the 10-year interest rate is, because that's what affects mortgage borrowing, corporate borrowing, and the rates that really matter for the economy. Now the Fed isn't leaving the longer term rates sort of up to chance. I mean, not that they're not leaving them up to chance, but that they have reached the zero lower bound, so now they're directly trying to affect the long rate, which I don't see as being so different from affecting the short rate and expecting it to feed through to the longer term interest rates.
You want to help out?
No, I thought that was I mean, so the conundrum period in particular is sort of interesting. The statement was short-term rates went up and long-term rates didn't go up as much, or in fact, the low went down. And so the response, the public response was that means you have to do a bit more at the front end. So then again, that means that the focus really is all at the long end of the curve anyway. So in that sense, that sort of shows that the distinction is less coveted, I think was the point. Thought Mike's point about the problem of waiting too long and possibly misinterpreting the macroeconomic data is right, but it's been a problem since time immemorial for monetary policy. And then your point about the Taylor rule, I think that you can tie back to the conundrum period. If you specify the Taylor rule in terms of the federal funds rate, but in fact, if as Greenspan said, it's the longer term rate that's meaningful for economic activity, presumably the utility of a Taylor rule in a conundrum type period, you'd have to sort of recalibrate that as well. So whether or not one has a great chart map for what you're doing right now is a valid question. My question was, is that inherently different from where it had been historically?
Okay, let's, sorry to take everyone down that tributary. It was a good conversation though. What other questions do we have out there? We have straight.
Yeah, somewhat of a lawyer's political question. Players in the market here, there's been a lot of references to let's say, casino, or people are playing the market rather than investing in the basic economy. World population 7.2 billion or something like that. It's going to go up to 8, 9, and 10. What my question is really, what is the role of hedge fund players and the speculators in the market? How do you see them historically? How do you see them as players today? How do the various coordinations that take place factor in the role of these players in the marketplace?
Okay, so to have a quick response to that, I think I would like to put it a bit more general. I think the entire question would be how to decide between good bubbles and bad bubbles. Would we decide about what is good for again, kickstarting, helping the real economy to work? And I think this is a very important question. So which part of the financial markets is really, in the long run, helpful for the real economy? And this is, as I still see the financial markets in a kind of a supporting function, and I think they are very necessary. And of course, some market participants tend to the overarching answer, whatever we do, it will help somewhere, somehow. There I'm a bit more skeptic than maybe in the room as some market participants, so I would not rate everything what financial markets do in creating new products will really help the real economy. Or on the other hand, even if it may help the real economy, on the one hand, it may create a kind of a new dimension of interconnectedness we then, for the next crisis, again, will in a certain way overlook. So I am guilty of the same thing. So when we saw it coming, but when somebody asked me, and I think this is the same thing as Greenspan put it in his famous interview, I never thought that the markets would not do a good risk allocation, and it didn't work like that. And I think this is an issue we have to take care of, indeed.
Michael, I want to challenge something that you said earlier, which is along these lines about the tech bubble bursting and the consequences not being very severe, and we've had stock crashes before. So when I look at the history, the tech bubble burst, and we had a recession, and the Fed responded to it by pushing interest rates very low, and it was very slow to raise rates after that, and that moved in due course to a housing bubble that was even more damaging. So can we say the bursting of a stock bubble or the bursting of any bubble, even in the absence of leverage, is necessarily such a painless development that we should shrug our shoulders about?
Well, I guess again, taking a historical perspective, the Fed made a huge mistake in 1928 and 29 by focusing on the stock market, and they kept tightening, hoping to burst the stock market. And what they did was create a recession, and then the stock market crashed afterwards. And I buy the argument that the stock market crashed because they believed that the future real economy was not going to sustain the prices that there were. And then there's been a huge debate about whether the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. Of course, Galbraith said that was his story, but I think the evidence is that it didn't. Okay, and partly because the Fed did the right thing in 1929. But then if we look at all the other stock market crashes that we've seen, like 1987, okay, it was a non-event. I mean, it looked fantastic at the time. I mean, the size of the drop was enormous, the nominal drop. So, you know, I just don't see the stock market as that big a deal, really. And now, house price booms are a different story. Okay, house price booms, when they bust, do cause significant damage. We never had one in the U.S. until recently. Other countries had lots of them, and they had lots of trouble. Okay, so that I tend to make that distinction between the stock market and just based on empirics.
Does anyone else have anything to add on that question? Is should we only be worried about bubbles associated with leverage?
I don't know if we should be that concerned about bubbles unless the bursting of the bubble is going to have significant macroeconomic effects. And I think what Michael just said about stock market bubbles bursting not having those macro effects, whereas housing bubbles do, is right on, and that we should be concerned about housing bubbles, but I don't think we see a housing bubble in this country or anything close to it. And stock markets are less problematic.
I will give you the last word, Christian, if you have one.
I think I have really nothing to add to that. I think we have to be simply very careful. I think it is very difficult to get to common solutions. What is true for some US history and episodes. You may say that the US economy on the long run, I hope Michael could agree, is more responsive to macroeconomic policy than some European countries are, which has very different reasons. And I think it comes back to the main argument. I think we should really look for well-tailored concepts which will work between macro and micro policies, which will be taking care of spillovers between different economies of the world. And again, there is this issue of better cooperation. We are forced and bound to that.
Okay, well, we're at 4:45. I guess we have one more. I don't know if we have. Let's try to get one more quick question in there.
I wanted to sort of follow my question a little bit, but I do want to ask Michael, especially since he has, I think, the most benefit of the historical perspective. It was the question about, so what is the main risk that you worry about with the, normalization, knock on wood, coming, closer? I think you said that the most common mistake we seem to do is wait too long, I think is what you were saying. And in that regard, I wanted to hear a little bit more your thoughts on how you would compare 93, 94 versus the 2004 tightening, because I think of those as differently, but it seems that maybe you see them similar, or?
What, 1993, 94 versus?
Versus 2004.
That'll be our last question.
Okay, so 93, 94 was an inflation scare, and the Fed was trying to establish credibility for low inflation. This was in the Greenspan, Volcker era, and so there was, they thought they had things under control, but then the evidence started to show that there was expectations of inflation were going up, and so they thought that if we really tighten now, we're going to convince the markets that we mean business. Okay, so that's what I think happened then. 2004, 2006 is they waited a long time, partly because they were worried about deflation, which no one mentioned yet. Okay, as well as the recovery from the tech boom. And then they were taking this measured approach, okay, because they didn't want to scare anybody, okay. But I think that was a mistake, and I think they did by taking this measured approach, and keeping rates low for so long, okay. I think they did stimulate the house price boom. They didn't cause it, okay. They were an exacerbating force.
Okay, please give our panelists a round of applause.
Well, we will break until 6 o'clock. We're having a reception in the Concord room, which you go out this door and then up the steps to your left. We will reconvene at 6 o'clock for our keynote conversation.